Stephen King is one of those writers that, even when he's bad, he's good. For the most part. Which reminds me, I was looking at my Stephen King checklist and realized I forgot something. Much better. So, Rose is good in this train wreck. That's about it. I'm not going to do my standard pros and cons style review because, frankly, there isn't anything else about Rose Madder that is remotely salvageable. Everything about it, save for our main heroine, is in such a state of uncontrolled chaos that is almost admirable. King does a great job with Rose. She's a woman who has been stuck in an abusive relationship for 14 years. Her husband Norman, the local sheriff, is an abusive, sexist, racist piece of shit with the complexities of a cardboard cutout. After years of being beat on, raped, abused, Rose finally snaps and leaves. Not only does she learn to come into her own as the story goes on, but King captures the fear any domestic abuse victim would feel in Rose's situation. She's hesitant to leave despite all her husband's put her through. He captures the fear of her being on her own with no discernible skills, the constant dread she lives with as she tries to put her life back together. She's one of his most overlooked characters. It's just too bad that everything around her is so subpar. Problem number 1. This book tries way too hard to be edgy. I get it, Stephen King writes about some fucked up shit. He does in all of his books. But it's so obvious that he's trying to be fucked up that it isn't even funny. Things like Norman sexually abusing a male suspect and raping his wife with a tennis racket isn't creepy. It's just kind of pathetic. King has gone on record calling this book and Insomnia his two try-hard books. And yeah, I can definitely see why. There's nothing wrong with messed up shit in novels as long as it flows well. This doesn't. It's like a teenage boy discovering masturbation for the first time. He loves it so much that he's just gotta yank it all over the fucking place. Issue number 2. There are several segments where instead of letting the reader figure shit out for themselves, King feels the need to explain things. I know the show don't tell method works better in film than it does in books, but it can still be effective if done correctly. For instance, I know Rose is hesitant when leaving her husband because of the hold his abuse has on her. It's psychological, in a way. As the reader, I'm smart enough to put together that despite all of the abuse, she still feels almost honor-bound to stay and take care of her husband. I know this, and yet, King goes on to explain how the house was like a dog in a cage, it was her prison, and she's now escaped. It saps any emotional punch that the scene had because he feels the need to explain why the scene is supposed to be emotional to begin with. King has a habit of explaining things in great detail in his books, but here he goes to such pains that good emotional moments are wrung dry. Problem number 3. Half of this book is written from Norm's point of view, which is fine. But for some reason, King felt the need to italicize every chapter that is in Norman's perspective. It's kind of a minor gripe, but it was a real pain on the eyes to read. Alright, problem number 4. Like I said, this usually isn't how I go about my reviews, but there's literally nothing good about this book, so it's better to just go down a list and just name off each problem. So yeah, problem number 4. King feels the need to give Rose a romantic interest. Let me explain why I hate this. Rose just got out of a horribly abusive marriage. She's emotionally frail, struggling to take care of herself, in constant fear, and suffering from some crippling anxiety and PTSD. She's also, as you may have noticed, severely codependent. I know there are people out there who go from one bad relationship and then jump immediately into another, but that's not a healthy thing to do. And to backpedal, before some of you comment, yes, I am also aware that in one of the stories I have published online, one of my characters gets out of an abusive relationship and jumps into a new one. But there's a reason. I have certain things planned for that character. It's just a really severe pet peeve of mine when I'm reading a book with a character who's just gotten out of a horrible relationship situation, just to jump headlong into another, and for the writer to portray that as something that is healthy and necessary to the healing process. It isn't. Anyone in Rose's situation needs some significant time to heal. They may need therapy, possible medication. Trauma isn't something that is solved solely with the love of another person. I'm aware shitty, sappy romances would lead you to believe otherwise, readers, but that's about as true as this novel is subtle. And now for some more serious issues. I hate Norman, and not for the reason I should. He's your standard, two-dimensional redneck. This story would have benefited greatly from him being an intellectual villain. Maybe have him be very smart, a wordsmith, someone that can get what he wants due to his wits and not his brawn. Let me try and explain the circle of abuse, okay? It's very common for the partner that is abusive to do something horrible to the one who's being abused. And then, after the abuse, they will immediately do something nice to drag that person back in. That's the circle of abuse. There are moments in the book where Rose remembers fond moments that they've had, but for the most part, there is no circle. He's just constantly beating on her and constantly being a piece of shit. It doesn't really make any sense when you take into consideration why someone would stay with an abusive partner. I feel like if he was more of an intellectual villain, someone who knows what to say to keep someone with them, someone who knows how to act suave and sophisticated when they need to, that would better explain why Rose stayed with him for so long. I'm not blaming her by any means. You should never blame an abuse victim for the fact that they were abused. But the fact is, it would have made more sense if he was sort of a smart, smooth-talking villain instead of a two-dimensional abusive redneck. There are moments where he's following Rose, and he's able to guess, what she'd be doing now or how she would react to certain things, but that's not intelligence. That's just him being married to someone for 14 years. He throws his power around and uses it to his advantage, but he's uninteresting otherwise. There was a moment where I thought maybe King was taking him in a more complex direction. Norman starts to think of Rose out in the world, in a strange city, and begins to fear if a rapist or someone would come along and hurt her. For a second, he's actually scared for his wife. I thought, oh, I see, he's an abusive ass, but in his mind he thinks he's doing what's right. But no, it's just an out-of-place segment where I'm sure King thought he was making a point, but didn't actually. Annie Wilkes is scary because she's almost two-faced in how she acts. Well, not almost, she is two-faced in how she acts. One minute she's sweet as pie, and the next she's a raving lunatic. She goes from helping people to cutting their feet off with an axe. Tak works as a villain because he's a symbiote that needs humans to survive. He takes over people's bodies and makes them turn against the other people that they love and care about. Norman is a cartoony asshole without a hint of development. Oh, and on top of that, he murders people by biting them. Seriously, he bites them to death like a dog. This might work for Cujo because of the fact that, dogs becoming rabid and murdering people has happened before in real life. And, this might just be me, but I had a severe dog phobia as a kid, so this is automatically unsettling for me. But Norman murders a man by biting into his jugular, and then murders his ex-wife the same way. This book came after the likes of Salem's Lot, Misery, and Cujo. I'm not saying writers aren't allowed to have off days or off books, it happens to all of them. But King could have made this guy so much better. Instead, he made an evil, humanized version of fucking Marmaduke. There are moments in this book that are supposed to be scary, but end up being hilarious. Like Norman biting people to death, or saying stupid rhymes and making up little jingles to sing as he's hunting his victims down. And another part that made me laugh my ass off. Rose is telling her boyfriend Bill about the abuse she sustained at the hands of her husband, and she tells him about the time that Norm followed her around with a pencil and kept poking her with it. All the while he kept saying, "Poo, poo, poo." And she's saying this like it's some horrible traumatic moment she had to endure. A man poking her with a number 2 pencil and saying poo over and over again. The final issue is that this book slows to a crawl in the latter half. So Rose finds this painting at a pawn shop, and it turns out to be an interdimensional portal to a Greek fantasy world, where she meets a woman named Rose Madder and has to help her get her baby back, which correlates to a miscarriage that her husband caused years prior, and she has to fight a bull, which I guess is supposed to represent her husband, and fuck me, when did this turn into Narnia? The story of a woman running from her abuser is scary. That alone could have been a good book. Instead, he had to shoehorn this fantasy shit in, and I mean it, he shoehorns it in. It doesn't pop up until well into the latter half of this thing. Not only that, but when Norman finds his wife, she leads him into the painting and Rose Madder kills him. Rose gets a few good punches in, but she's completely fucked out of her revenge. It's mind-numbing how idiotic the fantasy crap is. It wasn't needed, it comes out of nowhere, and the book ends on a whimper because of it. The only thing about this book that is good is Rose. And I mean it. She's really good. The rest is an uneven mess, with unintentionally funny moments, repetition about how Norman wants to get his wife up close and how Rose is rosy real. Good characters like Pam and Anne, the people who worked at the abuse shelter where Rose was staying, are killed off for no other reason than to show how evil Norman is. Norman himself is two-dimensional. He's a bland villain that bites people to death, and to top it all off, there's an unnecessary fantasy element that turns the story into an R-rated Narnia. I'm gonna give Rose Madder a D-.